In this video, we will learn how to take the extension we have inside our geometry and build an extender piston to add to the rig. In order to do this, we need to change the parent of the wrist bone to make some room. Then we can add a new bone to which we can parent the extension. We'll then learn how to implement a couple of new constraints in order to create a piston-like extender that faces the correct direction at all times and doesn't extend past a certain distance. Welcome back to the Robot Arm Animation Series Part 2, where we are creating an armature with bones and controls to control our robot arm's movement. In the last video, we set up these two wrist controls, one for the movement and one for the rotation, so that it moves and rotates exactly like we would expect a real robot arm to move and rotate. And we set it up to make it really easy to select both of these bones and move them even at a very far distance away. And this is very smooth. It moves like we would expect it to move. And we avoid all those nasty dependency loops. And this setup is absolutely just fine if you don't have anything to extend out. So if I take my move control and I bring it out here, you can see the control extends out over here, but the arm doesn't. And this works just fine if we don't have anything to extend. So if you are working with a character or a robot that doesn't have an extension, this is going to work just fine for you. However, we do have an extension inside this casing here that we want to be able to extend it out. And in this case, this actually is not going to work for us. First of all, this piece here needs to actually extend out with the control. So let's go ahead and change that now by making sure that bone is selected, coming to the bone constraint properties, and changing the target bone from bone IK to bone move. Now just changing it straight away is going to break it, so we need to actually go back into our resting pose, which is A, Q, because of our quick favorites we added this, all, and from here it's still broken, so we just need to click set inverse, and then this should be back into our rest pose. So now if we take our control and pull it out, you can see this is the effect we're looking for. So we want to be able to extend the wrist out here and have this inside extender come out like a piston. And this actually is not very complicated to do at all. We just need to make another bone that our extender can be attached to. So let's go back to our resting pose. And then I'm going to go into side view here. Let's press Alt-H to unhide all of our bones, except for this one. I'm going to select this one and press H to hide it again because I don't want that one floating out as a distraction. And then I'm going to press / to go into local view, and then tab to go into edit mode. Now remember, I can select this one here. The outer one is, if we come to our bone properties, it's our bone move. And then the inside one, if I just keep clicking until this one is selected, then this one is our bone wrist. So I want to take the head, which is up here, of either of these. I don't want this piece here because that's part of this. But I want to take the head of one of these in here. It doesn't really matter which one, so select one. And then we're going to press E to extrude and start moving your mouse, and that will extrude out another bone. And then we're going to make it point in this general direction over here towards our IK bone. And I'm going to click to drop it right here. And let's go ahead and rename this one as well to bone piston, or you can put extender or whatever name you want here, just as long as you know which bone it's referring to. Okay, let's go back into pose mode, / to go out of local view, and let's go back into object mode. Remember, that's Control Tab, and then I'm going to zoom in here and we're going to select the inside piece. Now, just like the bones, I have to select it and then just keep selecting until you can see the outline for that inside piece. Now I'm going to press and hold Shift and select the armature, Control Tab to go back to pose mode, and then select our bone piston, and then Control P, and then choose bone. All right, let's zoom out here and grab our control and see what's happening. Well, so we do have our piston parented to the bone, but we don't have the bone parented to anything. It's just staying there. So let's go back to our rest pose, and we're going to do the same thing we did in the last video, and we're going to select our bone piston, come to our bone constraints, and add in a child of constraint. The target will be the armature, and the bone will be our bone move. This is just the same thing we did for the wrist bone. So the wrist bone and the piston bone should both now be parented to our bone move, which controls everything. All right, so now it's moving with our control, but you can see we've got a couple different problems. The first one is it now comes outside of the robot arm piston casing here. So we're gonna have to change that, and it also extends way past where it should. We don't want to have this extender floating in the air anywhere. So first, let's make this extender face the piston casing here at all times. And that we can do with a very nifty constraint called a track 2. So select your bone piston, go to your bone constraints and add in a track 2. Now make sure the track 2 is under child of. We can collapse both of these, and if we drag these here, we can actually move them to be stacked differently on top of each other. The one that's on the top is the priority. So we want to make sure the child of is the priority on top. So track 2 should be on the bottom, which it should be by default. So let's open that again. Same thing, armature and bone IK for the bone. And now you can see something's happened, but it's pointed at a 90-degree angle away from the IK bone, and that's not what we want. So if we move this, you can see it's always going to be at a 90-degree angle. So let's change the angle of that, and to do that, we will go to our track axis and up axis. And you can see this head tail. This just means what it's pointing at is going to be the head or the tail. So here's the head, here's the tail. So 0 is head, and then 1 is tail. We're just going to keep this at 0 for pointing at the head down here. And the way I like to figure out the proper direction this should be facing is we can choose the up axis. So right now by default it's Y. So we're going to test it on the Y, and we're just going to go down the list of the track axes. So we're going to select X. That didn't work. Then we're going to select Y. Okay, that seems like it did something, but not quite. And actually it's not doing anything at all. This is just like not having the track 2 constraint at all. So if I hide that, there's no difference. And that's because you can't have the track and the up axes be the same axis. And that's the same for the negative. So we're not going to select Y for these. We're just going to go down the line selecting the other ones. So Z, nope, negative X, and negative Z. Nope, that doesn't work. So let's try X. So negative Z doesn't work. Let's start from the top. Remember, we're not going to choose X because that is our up axis. So we've got Y, and ta-da! We have it now facing. So this is the combination we want for this one. Something else to note, that if we had chosen negative Y first, you can see it's pointed the exact opposite. If you have something that's pointed the exact opposite, well then just choose the other corresponding axis. So if it's negative, then go to positive, and vice versa. Okay, so now if we move, no matter where we move it, it constantly faces our IK bone. And we're also avoiding dependency loops because our piston is pointed at our IK bone, but it's parented to our control, and the control isn't parented to anything. So we don't have two things depending on each other at the same time. But we have one more problem that we need to solve, and that is we don't want this to extend past the casing here because we don't want the extender just floating out in the middle of nowhere. And this is really easy to do with another constraint. So what we're going to do is we're going to bring it inside the casing right before it comes out, however far you want it to be. If you want it to be only half, then go halfway. It doesn't matter. I'm going to pull it all the way to maybe right about there. Let's just see what that looks like on all sides. Yeah, that's all right. So this is where I want it to stop extending. So let's select the piston bone and then collapse our track to add in another constraint called limit distance. So this is going to allow us to limit the distance to the IK bone. So before we choose our target, we want to take notice of this clamp region. So we have inside, outside, and on surface. So inside means that this is the furthest distance away from the IK bone that we can be. Every other distance inside this area is allowed. But if we choose outside, that means this is the closest that we can get to this bone, and then every other distance outside is permissible. So we just want to make sure we choose inside because we want everything inside this area to be okay, but everything outside of that is off limits. We don't have to worry about the distance here because it's going to be set automatically from the position that we are in right now. So with all that said, let's select our armature for the target and then the bone to be bone IK. And you can see it calculated the distance automatically at 2.74 meters, which is how far we are currently away from the IK bone. Now you can also choose tail, so head is 0 and then tail is 1. But then that right now is going to be referencing this piece here, this little circle, but we don't want it to reference that. We want it to reference this circle here. So select that again and bring that down to 0, which is what it is by default. Okay, let's see what we have now. If we pull this away, oh, look at that. That is exactly what we want. And what happens if we go inside? All right, and then it goes back in to our robot arm. And this works just like a little extender piston type thing. Okay, now all we need to do is parent the wrist to the piston so it doesn't move past it here. We don't want the wrist just floating out here in the middle of nowhere either. So that's really easy to do. But before we do that, A, Q, all to get back to our resting pose. Select the bone wrist and change bone move to bone piston. And after it twists out of shape, all you need to do is click set inverse. And now everything should be working exactly like we want it to. Yes. So we can extend the control past, but we can't extend the wrist or the extender past. And the extender constantly points to our IK bone, which is good. And since our wrist is actually parented to the piston, it also constantly faces the IK bone as well. Okay, let's clean this up a little bit here. So we still only need just these two controls, the move and the rotate. So let's take our piston, our IK bone, and our base, just shift select all of those, press H to hide them. And I don't want this selection here either, so let's go back into object mode just temporarily and click out to deselect everything, select our armature again, and go back into pose mode. All right, now we can move it and extend it and rotate it any position, any direction with only two controls. Very, very useful. Very easy to accomplish any sort of animation that we need the robot arm to do. Perfect. We are almost done before we can actually start animating this thing. The last control that we need to add is one for our claws. And so that is what we're going to do next. So when you are ready, head on over to the next video.